What I can tell you from the conversations that the Prime Minister has been having, the Minister of Foreign Affairs has been having, the Minister of International Trade has been having, the conversations I've been having, our allies are very interested in Canadian LNG.
Trump thought he could corner Canada. On June 30th, 2025, his administration slapped a brutal 35% tariff on Canadian goods, including a 10% hit on energy. The message was crystal clear: bow to Washington or pay the price. But instead of folding, Ottawa flipped the script. That same week, a massive LNG tanker slipped out of Kitimat, British Columbia, not heading south to the United States, but west, slicing across the Pacific to deliver Canada's first ever liquefied natural gas shipment to Asia. Japan and China were the buyers. This wasn't just another trade deal. It was a geopolitical pivot, cutting America out of a market Canada had once supplied almost exclusively. And it sent shockwaves through both capitals. Because this was just the beginning, and the full story behind it is even bigger. Stay tuned, like and subscribe, and keep watching. For decades, Canada's natural gas exports flowed almost entirely one way, south. Pipelines snaked from Alberta and British Columbia into the American Midwest and Gulf Coast, feeding refineries, power plants, and industrial hubs. On average, 8.8 billion cubic feet of Canadian gas crossed the border every single day, worth roughly $8 billion a year. Washington could practically set the terms because Ottawa had no serious alternative. That dependence became a weapon the moment Trump's tariff threat landed. In his August 2025 trade announcement, energy was right there on the list, a 10% duty, tucked inside a sweeping 35% tariff wall on Canadian goods. For the White House, it was leverage. For Canada, it was a wake-up call. Relying on one buyer, especially one wielding tariffs like a political hammer, was a strategic liability. The answer? Break the monopoly. And the key to that escape was a place few outside the industry had even heard of: Kitimat, British Columbia. On June 30th, 2025, the $40 billion LNG Canada terminal roared to life. The scale alone was staggering, the largest private investment in Canadian history. Its mission: take natural gas from Western Canada, cool it to minus 162 degrees Celsius until it became a liquid, and load it onto massive carriers bound for global markets. Suddenly, geography was Canada's ally. From Kitimat, the shipping route to Tokyo was just 10 days, half the time it took from America's Gulf Coast. The first shipment to Asia was a statement, not just because it bypassed the US entirely, but because of where it went: Japan and China, two of the world's hungriest LNG importers. Asia's appetite for cleaner-burning fuel was surging, driven by the phase-out of coal and a growing push for energy security. These buyers were willing to pay a premium, a far cry from the price-pressured US market. And Kitimat wasn't just a port. It was designed as a showcase for modern energy production, powered largely by British Columbia's hydroelectric grid, giving it one of the lowest emissions profiles of any LNG facility on Earth. In an era where carbon intensity can decide a contract, that mattered. But the most striking feature of this project wasn't technical. It was political and cultural. The Haisla Nation, whose traditional territory includes Kitimat, wasn't just consulted. They were partners, with an equity stake in the facility and the associated infrastructure. For indigenous communities long sidelined in resource development, it was a blueprint for how major projects could be built with consent, benefit, and shared control. This pivot didn't happen overnight. The idea of LNG exports had been floating for years, stalled by regulatory hurdles, environmental reviews, and brutal global competition. The US, Qatar, and Australia had dominated the LNG scene, building capacity at breakneck speed. But Canada's trump card was its location, a Pacific Coast outlet much closer to Asia's ports than the Gulf or Middle East. And now, that advantage was being put to work. By sending its first tanker to Asia, Canada signaled it was no longer a captive supplier to the US. This was diversification in its purest form: new buyers, new routes, and a new bargaining position. Washington couldn't threaten to choke off a market Canada didn't depend on anymore. The numbers spoke volumes. Kitimat's initial capacity was set at 14 million tons of LNG per year, with plans already sketched for a second phase that would double output to 28 million tons. That expansion alone could vault Canada into the world's top 5 LNG exporters, alongside Qatar, the US, Australia, and Russia. But this wasn't just about economics. It was about leverage, the ability to say no when the US came knocking with unfavorable terms. It was about giving Canadian policymakers and energy executives the freedom to target markets based on profit, not proximity. And it was about locking in long-term contracts with countries that saw LNG not as an optional commodity, but as a cornerstone of their energy survival. Of course, the move wasn't without risk. Building and operating an LNG megaproject in Canada comes with some of the toughest environmental regulations in the world. Construction costs were massive, and while hydropower kept emissions low, global environmental groups were watching closely, ready to pounce on any misstep. On top of that, competition was fierce. Qatar's North Field expansion, new U.S. terminals on the Gulf Coast, and Australia's ongoing LNG dominance all meant Canada would have to fight for every ton it sold. Yet, for now, the symbolism outweighed the hurdles. In one decisive week, Canada had gone from tariff target to trade trailblazer. The message to Washington was unmistakable: you don't hold all the cards anymore. And this was only the first act. The real shock would come when the long-term contracts started shifting and the U.S. began to realize just how much market share it stood to lose. Because this wasn't just one shipment. It was the start of an entirely new energy map. But that wasn't the whole story. What happened next turned a headline into a full-blown geopolitical tremor. Within days of that first Kitimat shipment leaving for Asia, analysts began running the math, and the numbers spelled trouble for Washington. For decades, U.S. refiners and energy companies had relied on a steady, predictable flow of cheap Canadian gas. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable. Now, that pipeline-fed comfort zone was under threat. And here's the kicker: Asia wasn't just paying more. It was locking in multi-year contracts. Japan, South Korea, and China, 3 of the biggest LNG buyers on Earth, were looking for suppliers who could guarantee delivery without the political baggage of U.S. foreign policy. Canada fit the bill. No sanctions risk, no Gulf Coast hurricane shutdowns, and no shipping choke points like the Panama Canal to navigate. Just a direct line from the Pacific Northwest to Asia's industrial heartlands. For Canada, the timing was perfect. Trump's tariff blitz, meant to force concessions, instead gave Ottawa the perfect excuse to accelerate deals with Asia. Each cargo heading west instead of south meant more bargaining power. Every ton of LNG sold at a premium in Japan meant less dependence on American buyers. The Kitimat terminal's design played directly into this strategy. With its hydroelectric-powered liquefaction process, it could claim one of the lowest carbon footprints in the industry, a major selling point in markets where climate commitments are now baked into procurement rules. Japanese utilities and South Korean conglomerates aren't just counting molecules, they're counting emissions per ton. Canada could sell them a cleaner product without compromising on price. The Haisla nation's role also became a powerful part of the pitch. In Asia, where indigenous rights are often overlooked, the idea of a major energy project with active indigenous equity partners was both novel and politically attractive. It signaled stability and community buy-in, critical for buyers looking to avoid the public relations disasters that sometimes follow controversial resource projects. By mid-July, Canadian officials were already teasing Phase 2 of the Kitimat project. If greenlit, it would double capacity from 14 million to 28 million tons annually. That would put Canada in direct competition with some of the biggest players in LNG, not just as a niche supplier, but as a heavyweight. For context, Qatar's North Field expansion aims for around 49 million tons of additional capacity by 2027. Canada wouldn't match that, but it wouldn't have to. Its advantage was speed to Asia and a climate-friendly brand. But Washington wasn't going to take this lying down. Almost immediately, U.S. trade lobbyists began pushing for countermeasures, from revisiting existing energy agreements to hinting at more aggressive tariffs. The fear wasn't just about losing Canadian supply. It was about losing leverage. If Canada could sell its gas elsewhere at a higher price, the U.S. would have to compete for a resource it once took for granted. The stakes went beyond economics. Energy has always been one of America's quiet tools of diplomacy, offering supply in exchange for alignment on foreign policy. By breaking free from U.S. dependence, Canada was sending a message to the world. It could chart its own course. That resonated far beyond Asia. European buyers, still scrambling to replace Russian gas, began floating trial balloons about Canadian LNG deliveries in the future. Of course, challenges loomed. Global LNG prices are notoriously volatile, and while Asian demand is strong now, market cycles can swing hard. Building Phase 2 would require billions more in investment and years of construction, all while environmental opposition at home continues to grow louder. The Trudeau government, or whatever government follows, will have to balance the promise of billions in export revenue against the political costs of expanding fossil fuel infrastructure. Then there's the competition. The U.S. isn't standing still. New LNG projects in Texas and Louisiana are racing toward completion. Qatar's massive expansions are timed to hit the market just as Canadian volumes ramp up. Australia remains a giant, with the added advantage of being even closer to key Asian markets. Canada's success will depend on locking in long-term contracts now before the market gets flooded. But in the short term, the psychological shift is undeniable. For years, Canada's role in global energy was overshadowed by its southern neighbor. Kitimat changed that in one day. The image of that first LNG tanker steaming out into the Pacific wasn't just a photo op. It was a statement. Canada was no longer the junior partner. And for Trump, it was a personal blow. The tariffs meant to punish Canada had instead accelerated its independence. The U.S. president, used to playing offense, suddenly found himself reacting to Ottawa's moves. He could bluster about energy security and America first, all he wanted. But every tanker heading to Asia was proof that the leverage had shifted. The real question now? Whether this is a one-off show of strength or the start of a permanent realignment in North American energy. If Phase 2 goes ahead, Canada could go from sending 100% of its natural gas exports to the U.S. to splitting them between multiple continents. That's more than diversification. That's insurance against political risk. And it means that the next time Washington reaches for the tariff weapon, Ottawa can calmly point to a fully booked LNG export schedule and keep the ships sailing west. Because in energy, as in politics, the ultimate power move isn't shouting the loudest. It's quietly walking away from the table and doing business somewhere else. Canada just proved that the fastest way to break free from U.S. pressure is to stop needing U.S. buyers at all. In one move, Ottawa turned decades of one-way trade into a two-ocean strategy, and the fallout is only beginning. Phase 2 of Kitimat could push Canada into the LNG big leagues, rewiring global energy flows and rewriting North America's balance of power. But here's the thing. This isn't just about gas or ships or contracts. It's about who sets the terms in the next decade of global trade. And right now, Canada is showing that even in Washington's shadow, you can still cast your own. The question is, will Ottawa hold this course when the pressure mounts? Or will the next round of political and economic turbulence pull it back into old dependencies? If you want to see where this story goes and how it could change the US-Canada relationship forever, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because the next chapter is already being written.